Good afternoon. I'm Linda Friedlander, Head of Education at the Yale Center for British Art, and welcome to our public program, Art in Context, where specially invited guests present objects from the center's collections. Usually, these speakers are faculty, visiting scholars, pre- and postdoctoral students, but today's speaker is someone really special. Sam Bezilla is a Yale student guide and only the second student guide in 13 years to present one of these talks. Sam has demonstrated a 4-year commitment to the program, has been a leader in gallery discussions, and his annual collections talks have been creative, well-researched, and elegantly presented. His talk today is Ruins and Revisions, the life of John Constable's Hadleigh Castle. Please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the Q&A feature on your navigation bar to gather your questions, and we will attempt to answer them at the end of the program. But please feel free to submit questions at any time. If you would like closed captioning, a live transcript is available by clicking on the icon on your toolbar. Yale's land acknowledgement acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shattuck, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking people, have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. Sam is of the class of 2024. That makes him a senior English major and 4th-year YCBA guide. His past tours of the YCBA's collection has focused on 19th-century landscape painting and religion in Georgian-era art. He is also a student assistant in the Yale University Art Gallery's Advancement Office and the Yale Schwarzman Center's production department. As an opera and theater artist, Sam has directed The Infinite Energy of Ada Lovelace, Hand to God, and most recently, Hamlet. He is past president of the Yale Dramatic Association and Y Pop-Up, Yale's premier culinary arts student organization. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Linda. So welcome, everybody. Today, I'm going to be talking about John Constable's Hadleigh Castle, which is what you see on your screen right now. It was painted in 1829, and it's currently on loan from the center to the Yale University Art Gallery. It's on display on the 2nd floor, so those of you local to New Haven can hopefully go see it and appreciate a little bit about its creation, which is what we're going to be talking about today. The goal is to reveal to y'all something about Constable's process of creating. This is a very large painting. It's about 4 by 6 feet, showing you how an oil painting like this, at least in Constable's process, kind of how that functions, and also some of the interesting afterlives that the painting has had since the completed version was exhibited in 1829 at the Royal Academy. And also my usual job as a student guide primarily revolves around introducing the public to the Yale Center for British Art for folks who haven't been there before. So I'm also hoping that this presentation will explain what's really exciting and what's really important about having collections like ours that contain a lot of masterworks of British art, of which I think this is certainly one, but also a really deep study collection of prints, drawings, preparatory sketches, that all help us kind of understand and hopefully appreciate those masterworks a bit better. So who is John Constable, for those of you that don't know, and why should we care about his process? He is, perhaps the most, if not one of the most important British landscape painters of the 19th century, along Turner. Constable is kind of unique in that he never left England. He was really interested in depicting primarily the natural beauty of the English countryside, instead of the classical landscapes inspired by antiquity or visits to Italy and France that were most common for artists of his period. He To that end, he spent a lot of his time wandering the English countryside, especially the valley in which he grew up, sketching with pencil and with oil paints. It was on one such visit in 1814, so about 14, 15 years into his career, that he visited the ruin of Hadleigh Castle near Southend, Essex, which is where the Thames sort of empties into the North Sea. And the painting I have on your screen right now, which is an oil painting on paper that he would have done outside on the site of this vista, which was unusual for the period. It's something that you might associate with the Impressionists who came later, but this is something that is really kind of started by Constable. I chose this painting both because it was made on the visit that is the beginning of the story of Hadleigh Castle, but it also shows something that was critical to Constable's art, which is the sky. The sky takes up about 75% of this painting. And that's because for Constable, the sky was, quote, the chief organ of sentiment in a painting. The emotional core of his work was communicated by his really intense attention to detail of weather patterns, light, time of day. He's famous for creating a series of cloud studies where he would just paint the clouds in the sky and mark down on the back of those compositions the time of day, the wind pattern, the weather, the exact date and time that it was created. And we have a lot of those in the collection. And I think that you can see both in this work and in the versions of the Hadleigh Castle composition, you're going to see the fruits of that real attention. So the story of our work of Hadleigh Castle begins with this drawing in 1814 that is currently in the collection of Victoria and Albert Museum. This is a really small sketch in person. It's only about 3 by 4 inches, but it is, as you're going to see, the genesis of the 4 by 6 foot painting that is in our collection. Later in Constable's career, in the 1820s and 1830s, when he produced most of these large landscape compositions that he's known for, he wasn't spending as much time out in the countryside making preparatory sketches. He was actually returning to these earlier sketches, like this one done in 1814, and expanding them and bringing them into sort of these finished works. So 14 years passed from between when he made this sketch, this very rough sketch, and when he eventually returned to that work in 1828. And everything you're about to see is based essentially purely on this 3-inch by 4-inch scrap of paper, which is really exciting. So the first thing that he did to restart the process of making this painting is this oil sketch created in his studio in late 1828 that is in our collection. So this oil sketch follows the composition of that little scrap of sketchbook very closely. He's added a shepherd and a sheep in the bottom left-hand corner. He's brought the towers of the 2 towers of Hadleigh Castle, which I should have mentioned was ruined for about 300 years prior to Constable seeing it. So I'm just going to give you a little comparison here of the composition. And you'll notice that it's really quite strikingly similar. The line of the horizon is in the same spot. The way that the hillside slopes, the outline of the castle is really strikingly similar. And so what's changed with this sketch is less so the arrangement of objects, but him starting to discover what he can do with color and what he can do with the sky. It's a really exciting, dramatic sky that he's brought to life through a seemingly very thick and fast-seeming application of the paint, which I think adds to the tension present in this composition. I've taken a lot of tour groups to see this work alongside the original when they were both on display. And people invariably tell me that this sky feels ominous. It feels like on the right, where all of that black paint is, a storm is coming in at a sunset, indicated by the pink and the white on the left. The dark birds circling over the towers. It feels very foreboding, and there feels a real sense of impending doom and movement. That's what people have told me, and I tend to agree with them. And I'd ask you to really keep a tab on what, especially the skies the various versions of this painting make you feel. Because again, for Constable, that was at the heart of the emotional content of his paintings. So after he completed this oil sketch, this wasn't necessarily a linear process from pencil to oil to larger oil. He actually returned to making a pen drawing that is now in a private collection, in which he retains many aspects of the composition, but he decides to really broaden the sense of place and of horizon. So you'll notice on the right, we get a lot more view of the water. He adds a little sliver of land visible across the bay. And you also notice that the weather has changed a little bit in this pen drawing. I must specifically notice the prominence of sort of shafts of light on the right-hand side of the sky, just above the horizon line. That I don't think quite match the tone of the sky that's present in the oil sketch, which I think is really interesting. So he's not only playing with the sense of grandeur that he's hoping to accomplish in a further version of this work, but also perhaps not exactly set on the weather that he has had planned that thus far. So then he moved on to a full oil sketch of the painting. This sketch, which currently hangs in the Tate Britain in London, is almost the same size as the final composition. And this is something that was pretty unique to Constable. I mean, you can imagine the amount of work to create essentially two huge versions of your final work. But he, in this later part of his career, this was a common practice for him, creating a full-size sketch to really test a painting out before he makes the finished version. And this is unique to him in this period. He was working on this in the first months of 1829 before entering it into a Royal Academy exhibition, which was his first as a full member of the Academy, which in British art in that period was sort of the highest honor that you could achieve. He's very closely followed the composition of that pen drawing, especially the inclusion of sort of the big tidal flatlands. On the right, you can see that extra land beyond the water in the distance. The paint is still, pretty roughly applied. There's not a lot of evidence of sort of fine brushwork, especially in his depictions of plants and rocks and the crumbling walls. And there's also, I think, been a pretty big shift in tone between this version and the oil sketch, the smaller oil study. To me, the sky, there's less this sense of big contrast and movement, less a sense of time of day. We've lost the pink out of the sky that might suggest a sunset or a sunrise. And overall, the range of color, I'm just going to go back to the previous version briefly. The range of color in the second sketch, I think, has diminished a little bit. It's a little more muted, focusing on light blues, greens, yellows, and browns, rather than the larger range of color in the sketch. So it's become a little more soft-spoken. What's interesting to note is that, like I said, this painting is on display in the Tate Britain, sort of United Kingdom's national collection of British art. And that's because in the mid-20th century, the full-size sketches of Constable's finished paintings became almost as renowned and valuable as the finished versions. And that is largely, at least some scholars have sort of pointed out, that that's likely because people had become accustomed to the really rough brushwork of Impressionism and the sense that this was made on the spot, which this was not. And so the taste for this kind of more roughly painted landscape had sort of entered the public's imagination. So keep this image in your mind, especially, I think, keep an eye on color and on the mood of the sky as we now look at the finished composition. So this is what we have here in the center. It is the full title that in the Royal Academy exhibition was Hadleigh Castle, the mouth of the Thames, the morning after a storm. So it's the morning after a storm. And I think that especially again, returning to the sky, I think that is reflected more in this composition than it is in that first oil sketch. We do have dark clouds on the right. Those shafts of light that we saw in the pen sketch are back, providing some evidence that the sun is peeping through even these dark clouds. And on the left, we see blue skies beyond all of it. He's added a lot more detail to this work and executed especially the plants with a lot more attention. If I knew anything about botany, I could probably point out to you and tell you what these different plants are because he's added that level of precision. But that's not to say that in other parts of the painting, he's let the paint sort of announce itself to the viewer a little more, especially in this view of the ruined wall of the castle. He lets that feel a little more rough, a little more unhewn, perhaps contrasting the sort of completed beauty of nature with the decay of sort of the works of man in this ruined castle. So the narrative that has typically dominated our understanding of this sort of process of creation centers around one very important biographical fact for Constable. And that is that in November of 1828, his beloved wife, Maria, died. This was a tremendously impactful event for Constable, as you might imagine. He said that the face of the world had changed to him, and later he even called himself a ruin of a man. And scholars have often linked his sudden fascination with ruin paintings, which were not a genre he was previously interested in the death of his wife. However, there is also some evidence to show that in the years leading up to it, he became more interested in the sort of darker portions of sort of the romantic spirit. However, if you think about the contrast in mood between this final work, which would have been completed about we're not exactly sure, but about 6 months after the death of his wife, with that first sketch, which again, when I've shown these two paintings side by side to visitors, I almost invariably am told this one feels ominous, foreboding. The brushwork feels very, it's a rough sketch. It feels very sort of energetic, almost fevered. And this final version of the painting is a little different, right? The people, we've got a person kind of in the center of the painting driving his cows through this landscape, continuing on pastoral life, even as other things like this castle is crumbling above them. And we have this figure of the shepherd on the bottom left, for which a very small sketch also exists in pencil that is now continuing through this landscape alone. But it's the morning after the storm. So if we're going to project a sort of biographical or emotional narrative onto the creation of this painting, as some have, rather than seeing this as a communicating utter despair at Constable's situation, I think that by the time it got to this final work, there's more of a hopeful tone, this feeling that something difficult has happened, but he's going to continue through. So just to review the sort of narrative that I've given you of the creation from pencil sketch to a small oil study to back to a pen sketch, and then these two large oil versions. This is actually not the end of Constable's story with this painting. In 1830, so less than a year after the creation of the final work and its exhibition, Constable commissioned David Lucas, who is a printmaker, to create a mezzotint of this work. So we're going to take a look at that. And it's actually created two different versions that are now in the center's collection. So this is the first one that was made in 1830. It's a rather large mezzotint. And I think it's really important to emphasize that in the 19th century, sort of scientific techniques of reproducing images did not exist, essentially. This was an art form, more akin to, I would think, to translation than to copying. Another artist had to take Constable's painting, and in this case, it's a mezzotint process, and in Q&A, I'm happy to answer more about what that looks like, but essentially put that image into a steel plate, deciding how he thinks that this medium of a black and white print how to best communicate what he thinks is important in Constable's work. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be an exact copy, and I'll show you later. But the mezzotint specifically was fairly recently invented at the time of this creation, and it from the beginning was used primarily to translate oil paintings into a printed version that could be more widely circulated. It's distinctive because it uses tone, so contrast of white and dark rather than line, and it really can communicate texture very well, which makes it really good for translating oil paintings in this way. And if you look at it kind of one-off, this does look like a really good reproduction, and in many ways it is. I think it's still very exciting. I think it actually heightens a lot of the contrasts, makes it feel more dramatic than, and actually a little less peaceful, I would think, than the full composition, than the original painting. But it's actually not even the last one he did. This one was made in 1830, was not first exhibited until 1849, which was long after Constable's death. But in 1832, Constable commissioned Lucas to make another version of this plate that would be used for a book that was going to be a compendium of 22. It was later expanded, 22 of Constable's works, and this was going to serve as a sort of manifesto of Constable's beliefs about art and nature. He was inspired by Turner, had done something similar, and a similar thing had been done for the French landscape master Claude Lorraine in the 18th century. So Constable begins this book with a kind of a written manifesto of his beliefs, and he says, "The subjects of all these plates are from real scenes, and the effects of light and shadow merely transcripts of what happened at the time they were taken. The object in view in their production has been to display the phenomena of the chiaroscuro of nature, to mark some of its endless beauties and varieties, to point out its vast influence upon landscape, and to show its use and power as a medium of expression." Now, two things to note here. One, I think it's a little ironic that Constable claims that the effects of light and shadow are merely transcripts of what happened at the time they were taken, because as I've shown you, Constable essentially invented a new sky for a sketch in which he really did not note the weather at all, that he had created 14 years before. So although Constable's years of study and documentation of weather has helped him create these fantastic skies in Hadleigh Castle, it's not actually, even if he's purporting it, it's not an exact transcription of that day that he visited it. I also should mention the chiaroscuro of nature, meaning he had a feeling that nature presented itself in these beautiful, bold contrasts in the same way that chiaroscuro, which contrasts light and dark in art, does, which I think is really beautiful. And this book was actually how Constable first reached America in 1835. The book reached America 13 years before any of his oil paintings would. And so I'm just going to provide really quickly a side-by-side view of the two mezzotints and the final painting and their skies. And you'll notice that they're actually quite different, especially the larger mezzotint. Lucas includes these big shafts of light on the right, not present in the original. And I think that sky looks more appropriate for sort of Rococo religious painting in which, God has been enthroned with all his angels than perhaps a storm in the English countryside. But it just goes to show you that this is not an exact process of transcription. But I'm going to move past this really quickly because even these mezzotints are not the end of the line for this painting. Recent scholarship has sort of pointed out that the full-size sketch, actually the 4 inches on the left and on the bottom of this painting were additions. And now Constable is known to have done this before, to have created these, to added to a sketch with additional strips of canvas during their composition. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest, and I can go into that in Q&A if anyone's curious. It's some pretty interesting science done by Natasha Duff at Tate, but that these were actually added about 100 years after the painting was finished. So there was some light damage to the original canvas inside of those red lines. There's some damage to that. And someone We think it was probably the first dealer to purchase the work out of the original family, thought this needed to be repaired. And the only thing we think that he had to go on was not the final painting. That was in a private collection in America. But there's evidence to suggest that he actually had access to that book of mezzotints. So he had access to Lucas's version of Constable's painting. And so then rather than restore the sketch to what it was, he attempts to restore the sketch to the look of the completed painting, which adds a lot more than was present in this original sketch. And so I'll just show you very quickly a side-by-side comparison of the towers in the Lucas book mezzotint, the final, and the sketch. And if you'll notice, there's a real sense of three-dimensionality in the final Constable painting. Then it kind of gets flattened out. It looks a little more sort of cartoonish in the mezzotint. And then that's kind of the perspective that's copied into the finished sketch, the sketch's restoration, because the line of addition runs straight through the tower, and everything to the left we think was copied from that mezzotint. So we have a really interesting situation here where a painting, an artist makes a final sketch for a painting, then that painting the final painting is the basis for mezzotint prints. Then when the sketch gets damaged but becomes in vogue because of its style at the time, was closer to popular impressionism, they restore and change that painting. This is in about 1930 to look like the mezzotint, which itself may not look like the original sketch and looks like the final composition. So we're going to end the talk here, but this essentially, I hope that you've taken away something about the very mutable ways in which these paintings are made, and how an image that an artist has created does not necessarily freeze in time when that work first goes on display. So thank you so much. And if we have time for any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Can you hear me?
Now I can, Linda.
Okay, because somehow I can't get my video. Okay, there we go. Wow. Thank you so much. I think most of us who just got that viewing perhaps did not expect to see it explored in the depth in which you did that for us. And thank you for sharing the fact that you went and pulled out a mezzotint and had to learn about how to make mezzotints, and the fact that you pulled out works on paper from our collection as well, to round out all of the information and the history in terms of understanding how this work was done. You were more than just a art historian here. Let me just look, we've got lots of questions. We're just going to have time for one. Let me just go through here. Question here, Sam, do we have evidence that Constable was dissatisfied with the first mezzotint translation?
That is a great question, and something I forgot to mention. No, he hated. He actually really did not like Lucas's work. He said, quote, he described them as, I believe, deficient. Let's see, can find the quote. Deplorably deficient in all feeling, and hard, distracted, and common. But he still agreed to have them published anyway, which I think is rather funny. But no, he was not a fan of these versions of the print. And eventually, Constable and Lucas did fall out towards the end of the creation of this book. Good question.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam, and many, many thanks in the Q&A box for you. I'll save them and send them along to you.
Okay.
Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you actually next week same time, same place. Thank you and have a nice afternoon.